Stu, are you hearing me?
Yes, I am, Dave. How are you?
Just fine, standing by.
Okay. I was trying to cue up a little theme music for us to get going here.
I found out on my way.
Good evening. Welcome to Community and Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources that hopefully will help improve your life. I'm Stu Reed. I'm here with my co-host, Dave Bernstein. Hey, Dave.
Hello. How did people respond to what we did last night?
I got a lot of good responses from our folks that were on the Zooms on the symposium with us. And just to fill in our listening and viewing audience here, Dave and myself and the Internet Society of New York chapter co-sponsored a symposium, a virtual symposium yesterday that focused on community networks here in New York City, in particular those servicing public housing communities. And we had about a dozen experts and stakeholders from around the city, predominantly Harlem and the South Bronx, and really a very lively conversation. We even had participation from a community network expert and ISOC instructor from Nairobi, Kenya, that joined the call as well. So it was really well received, and just FYI for our listener viewers, if you want to check it out, go to our website at safeinsmart.org, safeinsmart.org, and check it out. It's pretty informative. What did you think about it, Dave?
Well, I got a chance to say that we need to connect everybody and to say something that people hadn't already heard, that even conservative Republicans now agree with us on that.
That I thought that was pretty amazing. Mignon Clyburn and a Republican, who's the Republican that co-signed the letter with her, Dave?
Robert Mudal.
Okay, and is he a current
No,
elected
he's a
official?
former FCC commissioner.
Okay,
Republican.
Republican.
He's conservative Republican, but he's an honest guy. And he can look at what's in front of his face.
Mm-hmm.
People unconnected are in trouble. And if they're in trouble, so is everybody else.
Right. So true, especially in this particular environment. You and I, we've talked about this issue for a long time. So we have always believed that there should be some sort of universal broadband, but in this COVID-19 pandemic environment, where access to resources and information is just so critical, it's cruel that so many folks do not have access to the internet.
People can live perfectly well without the internet, but there's a heck of a lot that we can do on the internet now.
Mm-hmm.
And that should be there for everybody. It doesn't need to be gigabit fiber link. Right now, wireless, Wi-Fi 6, LTE, 5G, and even older Wi-Fi gives a perfectly adequate connection that even lets you watch video, much less do less intense things like surf the web, get education, and see your teacher when you can't go to school.
Yeah, how about that? I mean, is that critical now or what?
Well, I've always questioned some of the things they do in school, but others are important. In fact, what was the initial incentive for the US to put in public schools? What was really important in the 1830s and 40s when they started public schools in Boston?
I don't
Take
know,
a
Dave. You
guess,
tell
Stu.
me what. I doubt that it was a pure of heart motivation, but what's your history perspective tell you?
Uh, well, it timed with the industrialization of Massachusetts,
Hmm.
the early textile and other factories. And they discovered that people in the farm communities weren't used to showing up at a particular time every day and having it heaped on them all day long. So, in one sense, the purpose of our schools is mostly to get you up, keep you out of trouble, and teach you to take what you're going to have to take all day long, avoiding the original term that we're not allowed to say over the air.
And I would say that clearly, in my mind at least, that initial notion has evolved as the country and the economy has evolved, that wherein they needed workers to run the machine of the country as the country industrialized. And that required a certain basic level of education and discipline that the school system probably imparted. And I think maybe it's not so much needed today by the economic engine, in that there's so much that is now being automated and turned over to AI and technology, that I think there's a growing concern. I know we've talked about it on the show before. There's a growing concern that this pandemic aside, that there's going to be a lot of folks left behind in the employment market, and that as jobs just kind of faded away. And with this pandemic, I mean, wow, it's a stark reality. So Dave, do you think, what's your take on, we now have close to 40 million folks that are unemployed. What's your,
Well, it obviously didn't have to be so, because across Europe, they're just not seeing numbers like that. Even in countries like Italy, Spain, and England, which actually have more cases adjusted for population than the United States. Yes, unemployment went up, but nothing like to the extent like the US. At least in England, I happen to know those numbers. And in places like Germany, France was hit pretty hard. They managed to find ways to keep people employed, spending far less than we've spent on our $3 trillion worth of bailouts that somehow didn't reach the people who really needed them by and large.
So Dave, what would you attribute that disparity in unemployment numbers to? Did big corporations?
Greed, power of people with a lot of money, Trump doing everything possible to help corporations to keep the stock market up and get reelected. Trump is getting really ugly. Have you seen what's been happening on Twitter?
Oh, it's amazing. Yes, I did. I saw the story. I'm in just a level of disinformation and lying that this guy is perpetrating is amazing, to the point where Twitter had to come out and do an asterisk footnote on his latest tweet about mail-in ballots. Why don't you fill us in on the details of that, Dave, for folks who may not be familiar with what happened?
Well, Trump lied, as he often does. Until now, Twitter refused to do anything about major politicians who lied. They turned around and they have some policies, totally ineffective, but at least well-meaning, to at least moderate or comment on obvious lies that are obviously harmful, like some of the coronavirus rumors. Trump put out some total nonsense, and Twitter chose to ignore it until yesterday. Trump put out a claim that letting people vote by mail would virtually destroy democracy. I don't have the words in front of me. Massive fraud, and is an attempt by extreme left-wing sources like Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Twitter to prevent his reelection. Twitter did something very mild. They put up a link saying, context, other opinions on similar topics, linking to several of the most respected outfits in the world. The evidence is overwhelming that there has not been much fraud in any US elections, and it has not been terribly serious in vote by mail. Why does Trump care? Well, he thinks, although the evidence is actually unclear, that if you let people vote by mail, more of the people who don't get out to the polls, maybe because they don't have a car to drive there in a rural area, because they're poor, are going to vote. And that will hurt people like him. Oh, did this man get outraged? Twitter was destroying our democracy. And he will regulate and do what it takes to prevent this. Strong action coming, he's tweeted. Twitter didn't censor those tweets. Although, frankly, most of us think Donald Trump is lying about almost anything he says he's going to do. He's the biggest bluffer I've ever seen in politics, and that's saying a lot.
Yes, it is.
So what else have you seen?
Do you think this is a real shift for Twitter in terms of how they're going to deal with Trump? Because we know that Twitter is his primary platform for spewing his bile out there. And I just saw a statistic that since 2009, which of course predates his election by a few years, he's tweeted over 52,000 times. So this is his way to get his story out, to get his propaganda, to get his outright lies out there. Do you see, I know you don't have a crystal ball, but do you think there has been a real shift at Twitter, or is this just a one-off type of thing?
I try not to say things when I don't know what I'm talking about. And I don't know anything about what's going on inside Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really clear that, if anything, the web and the major social media have been directly responsible for a massive amount of the hate that's out there.
Mm-hmm.
It came out that a year ago, inside Facebook, they did a study that just leaked out. It found that something like 60% of those connecting to extreme groups connected because Facebook's algorithms recommended them to.
Wow.
What did Facebook do about it? Absolutely nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Nor did it release the study and publicly denied that that kind of thing was what's going on. It's leaked out now. It's really embarrassing. It's really hard to know how to regulate speech and content on Facebook and YouTube and Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
People have been going wild on the left, saying it wasn't enough for Twitter to put a polite note saying, here's some other opinions from reputable sources. People were screaming. I think Kara Swisher was one of them in the Times, that his account should be shut down. Now, if Twitter was an ordinary organization, clearly they would have the right as an organization, a private organization, to make whatever rules they want. But Twitter is not an organization. It's a near monopoly power on how information gets out in this world. Should they be censors? I'm really skeptical about that.
Now, Dave, for our listeners, let's drill down just a little bit on that. It seems from my understanding of the situation, the line, the demarc is as to whether or not these platforms are just that, simply platforms for free speech, unedited, unadulterated, unfiltered whatsoever by the platform operator, or whether the platform operators are themselves publishers, such as a newspaper or television or a radio station. And I believe there's some protection under the Communications Decency Act. I just read about Section 230 that protects computer platforms from libel to the extent that they are not publishers or speakers under the law. Is that an appropriate demarcation, and is that where the argument is focused?
There's an awful lot of people who disagree with that. And some very important politicians among them. And even politicians who may or may not agree with changing it. In fact, I'm sure disagree with changing it, says that in the real world, the internet giants have become too powerful and the politicians are not going to let that stand. Now, that came from a left liberal, Reed Hundt, who was once an FCC chairman. He's not in favor of more censorship, but he's also seeing what's going on around him. Nearly the entire political class in France, Germany, and England, and probably the majority of the population, but I don't know that for sure, thinks that hate speech and things like that should be censored. In fact, that's the law in Germany, with multi-million-dollar fines being routinely threatened against Google and Facebook, although they haven't come up on it. Now, other countries have similar ideas. In Thailand, if you tweet or blog something derogatory of the king, you can go to jail, and people are. And think what the level of censorship in China or American allies, Egypt and Saudi Arabia is. They're certainly trying to shut down a whole lot they don't believe in. Pakistan has laws against blasphemy. I bet there are a dozen states in the United States who still haven't repealed laws against blasphemy that were very common in the American past. Israel has laws against blasphemy against Judaism that, in fact, internally have been imposed and enforced. What's right or wrong here is not an easy question, and I don't have any quick answer for you. Sorry.
Well, I'm not looking to you for an answer per se, but I do want to kind of elicit from you your insight about exactly what the issues are here. One of the things that I see is that there was probably a very quiet, undercover aspect of this issue that's been here in America all along, in terms of the media, newspaper, television, and radio, and how it operated. The FCC had the fairness doctrine about you'd have to present two sides of an issue if they're political issues or political candidates. There were certain decency requirements that had to be held. There was a veneer, and I use that word in quotes, veneer of objectivity that editorial boards of newspapers exercised around the country. And yet, in fact, from where I sit, there was often and almost consistently, economic and political influence on what got printed, what didn't get printed, how the news got presented or not. prior to the advent of the internet and social media. So, from my own analysis and observation, the issue has always been there, but it's been very quiet, kind of undercover, and not nearly as in your face as it is today, when you have media on steroids plus with the internet and with social media and with the globalization of media, if you will, over the internet. Everything has been just compounded and blown up, 1,000 times. So what may have gone.
Let's be more specific about that. Stu,
Hmm?
what are some of the concrete things that have happened that were certainly inspired and aided by social media? In Asia, perhaps.
Well, you look at the uprisings in North Africa and Egypt and that's going back almost 10 years, I think, where you had a lot of social unrest against so-called authoritarian regimes that were inspired and fueled.
They're not so-called. These are authoritarian regimes.
Fueled by social media and the tools that regular folks had to communicate with each other. I think early on it was not so much misinformation, but just information and connectivity among people that fueled a lot of those early uprisings. But we've seen an evolution now, and I think the last presidential election here in the United States, 2016, is a classic example of how the misinformation has risen to an incredible level now, where there's just so much misinformation out there, misdirecting people, throwing folks off in all kinds of tangents and dividing people. We've never seen anything like it. And I think now, fast forward 4 years later from that election to this one, who knows what we're going to see. But did you have some specific examples that you were trying to lead me to? What are some that you on your mind, Dave?
There are several examples in Asia where horrendous things have happened that good reporters from the New York Times and others believe wouldn't have happened without the spread of social media.
Mm-hmm.
Killing of Muslims in India has had a resurgence in the last few years. Riots happen. When rumors get out, oh, this Muslim teenager raped a Hindu girl, which in the ones they've traced have been absolutely untrue. What happens? A mob has formed, houses get burned, windows get smashed, and people are killed. So when we turn around and say, well, we want absolute free speech and we don't want a government interfering in anything, you're saying that we can't find an answer and shouldn't even try when people are getting killed. The same thing happened near to India, in Myanmar, where the hatred against the Rohingya people has led to many, many deaths. This is real.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something to ignore, and it makes it very hard to believe in absolute free speech, which has been my position for most of my life.
Mm-hmm.
I've been considered a free speech extremist for
Mm-hmm.
a long, long time. And now I'm just not sure how to handle this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let me give you.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you go.
Take it. I'm talking too much.
No, you're not. Go ahead.
Okay. One of the things that's poisoning discussions like this is how much of our media and political discussion is controlled by money. And we know that's true on the billionaire Rupert Murdoch's Fox News, But that's becoming increasingly true by the internet companies trying to improve their reputation, present their point of view, and spending literally hundreds of millions of dollars a year. I'm talking Facebook and Google primarily, Twitter isn't in that game, in the US and in Europe to promote their point of view. Their point of view can be Germany should not have laws against hate speech. Their point of view absolutely includes you're going to destroy the internet if you try to put a tax on a company like Google. And Google and Facebook are among the most notorious tax avoidance experts in the world. So one of the things I've seen, just as I've seen for 20 years reporting on communications, AT&T, Verizon, and Comcast spend $100 million a year. And for that kind of money, you get some very persuasive advocates.
You're talking
When
about
you're
lobbying
paying,
dollars now.
yeah.
Mhm.
So like Comcast chief lobbyist, David Cohn, is paid $18 million a year, is now retiring. It wasn't nearly as good as lobbyist as Jim Ciccone, I think it is, of AT&T, who says, no, actually, when somebody reported he made $9 million a year, that was slightly exaggerated. It's become even more so now. It's very, very hard to be heard on these issues without that kind of money behind you.
Mhm.
So one of the things that it does when we're looking at what are reasonable regulations on tech companies who are very close to monopolies and use that monopoly power constantly on the business side, what you're hearing is conditioned by the hundreds of millions of dollars they're spending to influence you. And their influence people are very, very good. In Washington, I call them the 2 + 2 = 5 gang.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, Dave, I certainly agree with you 100%. The money is an incredible dynamic. I make one observation, and that is that the money has always been an incredible dynamic in the mix of media and media control. Going back to the early days of the newspapers at the beginning of the late 1800s, early 1900s, and the newspaper empires that got put together, and then with the advent of radio, we saw big commercial interests starting to gobble up and consolidate radio groups, and then subsequently television groups, and to the point where the FCC even had, and this, back in the old days, the rule of 7, where you could only own 7 radio stations, 7 TV stations, and 7 newspapers. That was their attempt, the FCC's attempt, to limit the control of any one economic interest, because it was clear that the economic interests were, in fact, such purveyors of information and in many ways controllers of thinking and behavior that rule was out there for quite a while. But then you had the collapse of all that with, I'm not sure exactly when that happened. I think it was in the early 80s. It may have been under the Reagan administration. You would know better than I, but all of a sudden, there was a collapse of all of these rules around consolidation. And since that time, we've had mega consolidation within the entertainment and media industry, where you have folks like Rupert Murdoch, who own newspapers across the planet, along with radio stations and TV stations here in the U.S. in the very same market. He's got Fox TV, he's got the New York Post, and he's got the Wall Street Journal. All that right here in one market, the biggest market in the country, and many others are around the country, around the globe, where you've got that kind of concentration of ownership. So it's been there, it's not always been visible to the average consumer and the average person on the ground, but it's been there nevertheless. And what's happened now, it's just been so exacerbated and exploded into view with the growth of these giant technology companies. And, I kind of agree with you, David, having, been a so-called believer in free speech, knowing that, it was really kind of not a real thing, and that even before, I would say, especially before the new technology came along, uh, you didn't have a platform. You didn't own a newspaper. You didn't own a publishing company. Nobody's listening to you. You didn't have a platform. You get free speech all you wanted, but nobody's listening. And so, free speech had, was an artifact of special interests, publishers and media conglomerates. So it really applied to them. It didn't apply to regular people. And now, in some ways, it's kind of been flipped on its head because of the internet and because of the fact that now we all have these devices that sit right here in our pockets, our media devices right here. Something that one of my buddies calls the machine in the pocket, that instantaneously can connect you with folks around the planet, with voice, with video, with information. And it's really kind of really just kind of flipped on its head the whole question of what is free speech and what is allowed to be put out there in the ecosphere of information, if you will. And it's out of control right now today. Clearly, it's out of control. When you have a guy sitting in the White House that can spew, what is it, 10,000 lies? I've lost count of how many lies he has told since he's been in office. But when he can not only tell the lies, but he has the platform of not just television and radio, but he's got his Twitter account where he just puts out misinformation and lies on a daily basis. In my mind, it's exceedingly dangerous. He's trying to flip it all around and claim that he's being censored by the fake media. And, the fake media is fact checking him inappropriately. And so, it's really turning
Yeah, they're
into.
definitely doing it inappropriately. Most of them are not nearly strong enough, and often they don't outright say he's lying. Something I
Almost
can't
never
say
do.
on
They don't
radio.
call him the task. Yeah,
They're
they don't call it
definitely
task.
being
That's one of.
inadequate. There should be much stronger tearing him apart. If you cared about fruit.
I couldn't agree with you more, Dave. That's one of my big peeves with the media, in that they just give him the microphone, give him the platform, and let him spew whatever he wants to spew. They don't challenge him. They don't get in his face. They should be all over this guy, I think. In my mind, the media has been really complicit in not all, but so much of the negativity and the misinformation that he's put out there. And back to the money, my feeling is that this guy generates ratings. And I think media owners at the very top are perfectly fine sacrificing democracy to dollars. And that it really doesn't matter if the country is going down the tubes, as long as they're making their money. And I thought it was a crime, the way that they gave a platform to this guy when he was running for president in 2016, where they're covering all of his rallies live and all this incredible free publicity. And why? Because it generated ratings for them. I don't know the statistics. You may have done some research, but I'm sure that the news ratings and news revenues, particularly television news revenues, got to be way up over where they were maybe just 3, 4, 5 years ago. compared to today. And so much of that is because of that guy in the White House and all of the negativity and lies that he's telling that are working in kind of a really nefarious way to boost the profits of the media companies that give him that platform.
Well, especially the New York Times. The New York Times is getting crushed at the moment on the advertising side.
Okay.
It's been going down, down, down. In the latest quarter, it's down something like 60%.
Mm.
Advertisers aren't spending money when they know customers going to the stores.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Brutal, brutal pain for every advertising supported media in the Western world. In fact, the only media that seems to be doing well is the games people. People are staying home, playing games, and the big games companies have had really good financial reports.
But now, how is Fox TV doing? How is MSNBC doing? How is CNN doing?
They're all up, and and when they talk, just in ordinary conversations to the press, they're very clear that the controversy is why more people are watching CNN.
Mm-hmm.
And the Times is clear. That's why way more people are paying for a subscription. At the Times, most of the people at the Times hate Donald Trump. I'm sure that's true of the strong majority of their reporters. And as I said on the air before, the fools are not doing a good job because their prejudice shows in a lot of their reporting, and it's totally unnecessary.
Mm-hmm.
The guy hangs himself by his own noose. You just have to report him accurately. You don't have to be prejudiced. Your reporting should be fair and balanced and accurate. Remember, balance doesn't mean supporting lies, even if the liars are prominent. So it has definitely picked up on the left and on the right, and obviously more on the right, because there's more money there. But let me take it back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, because we all know this. It's really obvious, the big issues. The things I see because I'm a reporter looking closely, is how much of things like the discussion of the monopoly power of Facebook and Google and Amazon are downplayed in the press because of a very strong campaign to influence the press. You don't buy New York Times reporters by and large, almost never, or the Washington Post, or most academics. But there are always going to be people who agree with almost any position. So the way you if you can't give a bribe to Jules Janikowski at the FCC, or Mike Powell at the FCC, one a Democrat, one a Republican, that I'm absolutely sure would have thrown you out of the office if you offered him a suitcase with $1 million in $100 bills. Might even have had you arrested. They're honest on that level. So the problem every lobbyist in Washington has, you may be able to buy Congress. To a large extent, you can. A lesser extent, the Senate. But the FCC people won't take your money. So how do you buy them? How do you influence them? You buy the people they listen to. You buy their friends. You buy the academics. You don't buy the academics and pay them to lie. You find the academics who happen to agree with you and spend a lot of money making sure they're very visible and able to do all the research they want to prove what they believe in. And I've been watching how this goes. It took me a while. I first asked the question, how do you buy an honest man like Mike Powell? As I got to know him and became totally convinced he would not take a bribe. And I also watched what he did. And the policies he came up with, 90% of the time, are exactly what the big companies would have wanted him to do and paid him for. And I learned one thing was you find the people who believe in you and bring them to power. If Kevin Martin, his successor, got his job partly because Verizon made a point of supporting him when the decision was being made. Kevin actually was an honest man who's one of the very few people at the FCC who really seriously challenged the big companies and put his career on the line at least twice. And nobody even noticed. And most of the reporters didn't know what he was doing because they're too busy listening to the people who are paid to influence reporters.
Mm-hmm. So how do we bring that home, Dave, to the current environment with Facebook, with Twitter, with Google? How does that play into their positions and the platforms that they give or don't give? I mean, Twitter has now stepped up and put some sort of check on Trump. Is that going to continue? I mean, what are the economic interests that are going to drive that and going to help bring some sanity to the operation of these mega platforms?
Well, this is how it goes quietly in the background. The public things from the president on Twitter are amazing and never happened before. That kind of public stuff has usually been invisible and in the background. Mm-hmm. Everywhere. And I cover the EU, and let me give you a new example from Canada. The Toronto Post has long claimed it's a leading progressive voice. It just got bought, and the New Notice put out a nice statement that they will continue its progressive tradition. Somebody went and looked at the history of the new owners. They were major contributors to the Conservatives in Canada. Will that change the Post next week? They're probably smart enough not to do it like that. But over time, as they choose publishers and editors, they're going to choose people they're comfortable with.
Right.
And that's going to affect things, and that's how it's played. Mm-hmm. Are we going over the air on HCR now?
No, not yet. We are streaming live on YouTube, and we hope shortly to be able to figure out how to plug into a platform that enables us to be live on the WHCR website and perhaps even on their over the FM transmitter, but we're not yet.
But we should, even if we don't have to do a station break, give credit. This show originated, and when it can, we'll go back to WHCR FM.
90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. And, while we're talking about independent media, I mean, we're so fortunate to have a platform like WHCR Radio that is not beholden to any corporate or political interests and answers to the folks of Harlem, the residents of Harlem, the community, the voice of Harlem, 90.3 on the FM dial and online at WHCR.org. Pardon me. So if you get a chance, go online and give us a contribution, show a little love.
Well, and what's the alternative? As we were speaking, I got an email. It's called the CTIA Mobile Minute, and I've been reading it for a few years because it has a summary of the news of telecom. The CTIA is the Wireless Lobbying Association, but it used to be fairly useful and reasonably independent, and they sometimes found things I had missed there in Washington. But I think I'm going to cancel my subscription because it's really gotten out of hand. Mm-hmm. Top story today. The future is being created here. It's all about the incredible things that are going to happen because of Verizon 5G. Verizon is an AT&T controls CTIA. So it's becoming their mouthpiece in a way, and they've lost track of objectivity. Mm-hmm. Lots of and they have the power to hire real reporters who found real news, to the point that until now I usually read the thing, but it's gotten so bad and so prejudiced. An organization we know, but I'm not going to name here, spends more on communications people than it does on any of the programs it believes in.
Mm-hmm.
And it puts out internally, spending millions of dollars a year and the people to do it, utter blah propaganda. And it won't tell me how few people go to its website, but if half the articles on their website are insignificant things that the organization does and proclaims are brilliant moves for venerable and respected public purposes, it probably doesn't get many people paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a value to being honest. There's a value to being open. There's a value to having a reputation for telling the truth, or as much of the truth as you can get close to. Because none of us, I mean, I'm an experienced reporter with some respect, but none of us always gets it right. But you gotta do your best, or people who are well-informed will ignore you. Unfortunately, most people are not that well-informed. 80 million of them, a quarter of the United States, subscribe to Donald Trump's Twitter feed.
Mm.
That's, to me, more frightening than anything you could say. That many people are inspired by the kinds of things Donald Trump says. That horrifies me.
Yeah.
Well, we only have a few minutes. Let's do some tech news. What do you got?
Well, we're talking about Twitter. I just wanted to, mention the fact that a recent study came out that about half of the anti-lockdown tweets that are out there, of which there are many, half of them look like they are bots. They're not real people. They're programmed, automated bots that are out there tweeting anti-lockdown. I'm talking about anti-pandemic lockdown.
Now, who makes those bots?
You
do
know,
you think?
I don't know the answer to that. This particular story hypothesized that it could be a foreign government. It could be, a bad actor somewhere. Well, we don't know. What's your take on where they're coming from?
In the case of this one, there is a movement that's gotten a lot of money from the traditional right-wing sources.
Yeah.
To appeal to people who are sick and tired of being in the house after 9 weeks. And that's getting out is very appealing. Many people, not most people, but many people are willing to risk their lives going into a crowded bar in Minneapolis, as we're seeing in all the pictures on the internet. But sometimes the research has found out where and why. There were an enormous number of comments, repetitive, uninteresting, and clearly a function of bots and an organized attack on the FCC and net neutrality. And reporters went and found out and discovered a large portion they could prove were originated on some anti-net neutrality groups that were funded by the companies. Again, there's so much money in all of this stuff that you have to learn to be really careful.
Yeah.
Now, let me give you a much less interesting story than any of these political things. 5G phones at speeds in the hundreds of megabits are going to be common and cheaper rapidly. Rapidly in this country probably means next year. Rapidly in China is the next 3 months. The price of 5G phones has come down in China to $207 for a decent, almost 7-inch phone with all this 42 megapixel camera, decent, but not the absolute best screen, and so on. So the internet, for the people who are using the phones, is getting much faster quickly. And the news I bring is Digitimes, which I believe has the story right, says 2 companies, Qualcomm in San Diego and MediaTek in Taiwan, are going to come out next quarter with chips that will bring the price down under $200. I think at about $150, it'll be right for me to buy a new phone.
Mm-hmm.
So that's some of the good news.
Mm-hmm.
And it means more people will be connected. Nothing really connects people nearly as well as bringing down the prices. 400 million Indians have connected to 4G because the prices come down to $2 to $10. 400 million in 4 years. That is enough to change the nature of the internet, although most of the people in the West haven't noticed it yet. And it's 10 or 100 times more than any other effort anywhere to get people connected. Comcast may have connected 500,000 people with its low-priced offering. And yes, last night I spoke in favor of community networks, and I think it's great. But I think that the thing that really is important is to take what succeeded in India, low prices, but not so low that the company couldn't make money, and make sure the same thing happens in Mexico and Brazil and Nigeria, and maybe even in the US. Because if we brought the price of connecting down to where it is in Europe, a third less, sometimes half less than the US, or where it is in Asia, which is 80 and 95% less than the US, that's going to connect more people than anything else I can imagine doing, even though I'm delighted to support any effort that's going to work on that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I couldn't disagree with that, Dave. I'm not maybe as optimistic as you in that, though you have eloquently talked about how the cost of the technology and the cost of the bandwidth is plummeting. The economic greed of the folks in this country that control things, and the fact that they're just a handful of monopoly players and that government seems to be in their pocket. I'm not at all optimistic that we're going to see any significant savings in this country in terms of access or devices and their concomitant access with the device. I hope to be proved wrong. I hope maybe 5G is going to be a revolution. I'd like to talk some more about that on another show, and in particular to talk about some of the functionality benefits of 5G, over and above just the marketing hype that you've on so many shows have pointed out is so pervasive. And also I want to talk down the road about some of the hysteria, anti-5G hysteria. There's just been a bunch of attacks of 5G towers in Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. Folks that are tying in 5G to the pandemic spread. And we're not sure where that's coming from, what that's about, but I'd like to talk to you about that again on a follow-on show as we are running out of time here. So let me throw it back to you, Dave, for some final comments and observations.
Stu, I don't disagree with you that the powers that be may not let it happen that the prices come down.
Mm-hmm.
What I try to point to is that it's possible on the technical level,
Mm-hmm.
and it's possible because it's happening in other countries, and it could be possible because there's a lot of support, if even only for things like Wi-Fi programs that are only partial solutions. But I do what I can. I fight where I can.
Yes.
Been doing this too long to give up.
Well, I would
Keep
say,
on
Dave,
trying until I'm dying.
yeah, I would say
Somebody
carry
once
on,
said.
Dave. Carry on, Dave. Doing a great job. And thank you, Dave. We've been Stu Reed, Dave Bernstein. We've been kicking it about community and technology here in the city and across the globe. Here on WHCR 90.3 FM and streaming across the globe as well. Stay tuned for our next show coming up next week. Stay safe, stay smart. Thanks for tuning in.
Now, you can't keep me away from where I was born. I was baptized by my daddy's horn. Now, you can't keep me away from where I was born. I was baptized by the jazz man's horn. Oh, I found out on my way through Harlem. Langston Hughes, he don't live round here. He moved away one day from his way here in Harlem. I know that